For today's movie review, I'll be reviewing Kong, Skull Island, the overall 8th installment of the Kong franchise. Hell, technically the overall 11th film in the Kong franchise if you're including the 3 animated movies. And this movie has had a rather interesting production history because when this film was first announced, way back in the summer of 2014, the film was simply supposed to be just called Skull Island. And rumor had that the film was meant to be a prequel to the Peter Jackson remake. But as time went on, plans changed again that the movie would be just not a prequel to the Peter Jackson movie, but a prequel to the King Kong mythos in general. But sometime down the line, with the combination of the 2014 Godzilla movie making a lot of money, and with Hollywood being really obsessed with trying to create their own cinematic universes with any single franchise they could get their hands on, it was only a matter of time until someone over at Universal Studios went, "Hey guys, why don't we make our own cinematic universe involving kaijus?" Thus giving birth to the now dubbed MonsterVerse, which will all lead into the 2020 film Godzilla vs. Kong. But the big question is Kong Skull Island not only a good King Kong movie, but will it do a good job of being a part of the now dubbed MonsterVerse? As for the plot of the movie, it's about this team of scientists and Vietnam soldiers who travel to this uncharted island in the Pacific Ocean. And when they reach the island, they have a very unconventional encounter with this gigantic ape known as Kong. But little do they know that when they fought Kong, they accidentally reignited an ongoing war between Kong and his arch rivals in the form of the Skullcrawlers. And now it's up for the human survivors to not only survive Kong and the Skullcrawlers, but also survive any other prehistoric creature that they might come across. In terms of what I liked about the movie, the overall story is really simple to understand, and I like the direction it goes in certain cases. For example, I like the overall idea in terms of how they handle the mythos, because if you're familiar with your King Kong mythos, it's typically, the natives built this giant wall to keep out Kong or any other animal, and they usually sacrifice a human to please their god. This incarnation, yeah, the natives do worship Kong as their god, but they don't really give him human sacrifices, nor does this version of Kong demand it. I like that update in terms of the relationship for both Kong and the natives of the island. And speaking of Skull Island, I like the fact that the film crew actually went to various locations like Vietnam and Hawaii to make Skull Island feel like a real place, because with something like Peter Jackson's Skull Island, it's primarily created using green screen, which doesn't feel authentic. By having actual on-set location shooting, it makes the movie feel much more authentic. I also like that this movie is a B movie, like a high-budget B movie, something that we don't have enough of, because I like it when you have B movies like this that have a high budget. The CGI is pretty good, although there's probably a few moments here and there where it looks like the CGI could have been rendered a little bit more, but the CGI does its job just fine. And I also love this incarnation of King Kong as well, in terms of personality and physical aesthetic. Because King Kong, this time around, he's like a teenager stuck in a giant body. And I like how just lonely he is, because he is the last of his kind, so you definitely get good expressions from the combination of the facial expression and the body language of the character. As far as the visual aesthetic goes, it's like taking all the other previous incarnations of Kong and putting them into a blender to make this version. Because on one hand, when you look at the facial structure, it looks very reminiscent of the 1933 incarnation, and as far as the coloration and the body structure goes, it's very similar to that of the King Kong that appears in the Toho films, along with the King Kong that appears in the 70s remakes, but it also has the skin texture of the Peter Jackson incarnation. And I find it really refreshing that we have a King Kong that primarily walks on 2 legs and looks more like an ape with some gorilla features as opposed to looking like a giant freaking gorilla, because King Kong is meant to be his own species of great ape, which happens to have gorilla-like features. He's not meant to be a giant gorilla like the Peter Jackson incarnation. And I also love the creatures that Kong and the human characters encounter on the island as well, because typically the humans in Kong encounter prehistoric dinosaurs, which I do like. It's just, it's been done before. The creatures in this movie, there's a lot more variety to them. It's actually really refreshing to see this kind of variety because it's not just dinosaurs. Actually, there's no dinosaurs in the movie. Instead, we get creatures like giant water buffaloes, various giant insects, an octopus, and the coolest addition being the skull crawlers, which are essentially like these two-armed snake-like creatures. And I like the relationship between Kong and these skull crawlers, since they have like this rivalry going on between one another. And I like how John C. Reilly's character isn't as over the top as I thought his character would be in the movie, because when a second trailer came out, he looked like he was going to be really over the top comical. But then once you watch the movie, he's actually not as over the top. Like, I totally thought, once his character showed up, the movie's going to become a comedy. He definitely provides funny moments, but it kind of makes sense as to why he's kind of crazy. Also, I love the movie, tonally speaking, because it's essentially an allegory for the Vietnam War, only because, well, the movie takes place literally after the Vietnam War, and this is only enforced by the combination of, like, the news footage seen at the beginning, to several characters referencing the Vietnam War, and the soundtrack, which is primarily made up of songs about the Vietnam War. It adds a nice touch to the movie. And out of the many references that this movie makes to other King Kong references, my favorite reference in this movie is the part of the film where King Kong is seen battling the giant octopus. Because if you know your King Kong filmography, King Kong, before he fights Godzilla in King Kong vs. Godzilla, he fights a giant octopus, in which that entire scene is a direct reference to. And now that this movie is now a part of the MonsterVerse, chronologically speaking, this movie takes place before the events of the 2014 Godzilla movie, and it's also the first monster that we see Kong fighting. So I find it very interesting that the people over at Universal or Legendary are taking a lot of inspiration from the Toho films. In terms of what I disliked about the movie, the characters are really stock, but at the same time, I don't think in a movie like this I'm expecting a lot of character development, because if I had to describe this movie in a nutshell, I think it's trying to be something along the lines of like a George Miller film where the main character is the least interesting character, while the world around the character is more interesting, and we're just seeing the world through the main cast of characters in this. And also, it's a monster movie. I'm not really expecting too much character development in these type of films as it is. I'm just expecting a group of characters encounter a group of monsters. That's about it, and they do their job at doing just that. And speaking of the monsters, even though I love the diversity of creatures that are featured in this movie, we really don't get to see much of them. Because they definitely appear on screen, but as soon as they appear on screen, they kind of disappear for a bit. Which kind of disappoints me, because it's like, oh, we didn't really get a sense of like what these creatures are like, what are their mannerisms, what are their habits like. Like, I want to learn more about these creatures that live on Skull Island. And the middle portion of the movie does drag a bit to me through a combination of the pacing and the editing, because when it comes to the pacing, this is essentially the way it's set up. One group of characters encounters one monster. The next group of characters encounters another monster. Another character encounters another monster. And rinse, wash, repeat this formula over and over again, and that's essentially in the middle section of this movie. And also, when they encounter John C. Reilly's character, he's basically just nothing but exposition. And also, the way he gives exposition kind of bugs me, because as he's given exposition on the history of the relationship between Kong and the Skullcrawlers, it cuts back and forth between that and seeing Kong fight the Skullcrawlers. Like, I would have preferred it if it was like, oh, maybe we had John C. Reilly give the exposition first, then after that, we cut to Kong fighting the Skullcrawlers. But as it is, it just got really jarred as far as the editing goes. Also, there's one particular aspect in this movie that didn't really feel like it flowed with the story. If anything, it felt more like, oh, you've seen this in other Kong films, we just put it in here because it was just one of the many things we had on our list to check off. It felt like that. And the particular aspect of the movie I'm talking about is the quintessential Beauty and the Beast aspect of the Kong movies. I like the way this Beauty and the Beast aspect is handled in this movie, because at first, Kong doesn't really like the female at first, but as it slowly progresses, they start to like each other a little bit more. Although during the climax, I thought it was a bit of a stretch, but that's just me. Now, in regards to the tone of the movie, even though it works very well for this film, I don't know if it will work well for this universe. Because with something like the Marvel movies or the DC movies, you can definitely tell that each of those franchises take place in their own universe, even as something as poorly made as the DC Extended Universe. With something like this in the 2014 Godzilla movie, tonally they're completely different. Because when you look at this movie, it's a fucking B movie. with the 2014 Godzilla movie, it's meant to be a more realistic take on the giant monster genre. So there is a bit of a clash in tones in the context of this cinematic universe. So for my final verdict of Kong Skull Island, if I had to describe this movie, it's this year's Pacific Rim in that sense where the story isn't complex, but it doesn't need to be. It's very simple to follow. The characters aren't the most memorable thing, but they do their jobs just fine. And it's just a simple, dumb popcorn flick. The only real big difference, other than the fact that one features giant robots and the other one features a giant ape, is the middle of the movie, because I feel the pacing could have been better at this point in time, but before and after the middle of the movie works. As far as a Kong movie goes, it's pretty good. Again, what do you expect, of a giant monster movie? So, before I give my final rating, what did everyone else have to say about Kong Skull Island? Looks like the movie got generally positive reception, and so for my final rating of Kong Skull Island, I give it a 3.5 out of 5. So what is your favorite King Kong movie? And see you later.